we will move to the first panel discussion of today that will explore how shifting geopolitics, trade restrictions, the US-China rift affect markets, investment, and our economies. The panel is titled Markets Under Pressure, the Economic Impact of Return of Geopolitics. This panel is organized in partnership with the Taipei Representative Office in Budapest. And the panelists will be Elliot Wang, Representative, Taipei Representative Office in Hungary, Krisztián Orbán, Managing Partner, Oriens, Ming-chin Monique, Lecturer in Chinese Politics, University of Southampton, Richard Turcsányi, Program Director, Central European Institute of Asian Studies, and Tamás Matura, Associate Professor, Corvinus University. The discussion will be moderated by Lili Takács, journalist at 444.hu.
Thank you for coming and for staying after the opening ceremony and the keynote speeches. What is the return of geopolitics from the economist's point of view? Who is setting the rules and what happens to those who are not setting the rules? I think these are some of the million-dollar questions of our time, and I hope that we will be at least a bit closer to the answer with the help of our 5 panelists. I think we should start by establishing what do we mean that there is a return of geopolitics. And I'm turning to Mr. Orbán. If you had to name a moment or the processes when geopolitics returned to the forefront of politics, I mean in the sense that it has a more immediate effect on Europe's economic model, what would you name and why do you consider that as a turning point?
So I think that first we need to understand that what was the season, the period before, and I will be very fast. So the so-called globalization model was built on optimizing for productivity, optimizing for minimal cost. And we could get away with that because there was somebody who has set the rule and was there to enforce the rules. You know, that was the United States. Now that period is over. So the question is, what happens when there is no one rule maker and somebody who sort of challenges the rule breakers? And that's the situation that you are having now. So when did it start? It probably started sometime when Xi Jinping took over in the PRC, maybe around the time when the Made in China program was launched, but around 2015, but nobody quite realized it back then. Nobody quite realized that what is happening in China back then, PRC, when I say China, I mean the PRC, is fundamentally challenging the global order. So, but that's what was going on. One wake-up call was 2018 when Australia has rolled back a humongous PRC-coordinated influence operation, which made it very clear for everybody in the know that the PRC means a lot more than business. But I think other than the Americans and the UK, very few countries took notice. Europe definitely did not. For Europe, the wake-up call was obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that was the moment when everybody realized that some rules are fundamentally broken, and the United States is not there to punish the rule breakers. So from then on, it should be very obvious that we do not have a unified set of rules. We do not have a sheriff in town. So from then on, I think we are increasingly realizing that everybody is setting the rules.
Dr. Chu, how does China's behavior and rhetoric fit into all this? Mr. Orbán said that back then no one saw it, but were there any signs that experts could have seen?
I think the professor did point out a very crucial turning point to some extent in that the emergence of Xi Jinping as China's top leader has in some way changed the rules of the game. And over time, we have seen that the return of geopolitics is certainly a gradual process, and China is really part of the story. And so what I can observe is that the Chinese actions have actually really combined assertive rhetoric together with strategic economic moves. So on the one hand, we have seen Xi Jinping that has trying to increasingly frame the West, especially the US, as containing China's rise. And he has also positioned China as the champion of multipolarity. But when it comes to strategic economic moves, China has made various actions. For example, when it comes to the domain of economic statecraft, China has used a series of economic restrictions in the domain of rare earth and export controls of critical minerals, as well as regulatory measures as geopolitical tools. Specifically, recently, we have seen the Chinese accusation of NVIDIA's H20 semiconductor chips as posing backdoor security risks that could affect the Chinese side. In addition, the Chinese government has also accused NVIDIA for anti-monopoly law violations. And in the specific domain of semiconductors, the Chinese have also intensified various industrial policies that are really designed to enhance the domestic ecosystem. But I want you to highlight that throughout this process, the fact of the matter is that Taiwan has actually produced nowadays one of the most important advanced chips around the world, and Chinese firms have relied on Taiwan for this support. So this means that the issue of Taiwan is not only a sovereignty challenge for China, but also a economic security issue. Therefore, from the perspective of China, the access to and control over semiconductors has really become central to Beijing's strategic calculation. Yeah.
If you mentioned Taiwan, I would like to ask Mr. Wang. It seems that there is quite a wide agreement that China is a major player in the return of geopolitics. How has this influenced Taiwan's economic situation?
Well, I think in short term, immediately our economy and business is, I think, is definitely affected. But right now, I think it takes time to see the redirection of the trade flow or investment. But right now, as everybody knows that the business is always the cost-less oriented, and immediately right after the tariffs that imposed on every country, the TSMC was immediately announcing that it's going to invest $100 billion more US dollars in Arizona, United States. As for the small medium Taiwanese business, I think they are right now swiftly looking for some place for the less cost for their production line and also their investment. So I would say that in the near future, we will see some restructures of the Taiwanese supply chain happen.
Dr. Turcsányi, you made some quite interesting research and surveys about public attitudes towards China. Did these attitudes change as these events unfold, or were there any specific events that influenced public attitudes towards China?
Yeah, let me answer this from before the second Trump presidency and then after, because when we're discussing about the view of China and also the comparison between the image of China, the US sort of struggle for hearts and minds, I would say that the second Trump presidency has been a big turning point. So, before, and that kind of builds on what Krisztián was saying. Actually, what we see in many public opinion surveys is that the image of China, especially in Europe, in what we call Western world, was getting worse over 2010s, basically during Xi Jinping term because of growing human rights violations in China, situation in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, also what we discuss is Chinese assertiveness, South China Sea, of course Taiwan, then COVID-19 obviously added to that. Now, there is a bit of a caveat here that the image of China got pretty bad, but in the developed countries. So there was a big difference, if we look to the so-called global south. So that's also something to keep in mind. But a lot of that changed since the Trump became president for the second time. And, the change is huge, actually. If we look at the most recent public opinion surveys from Pew and others, we actually see that China basically caught up with the image of the US, or even according to some surveys, it has surpassed it. And now, that's because of two things. First, the most visible one is that the image of the US basically collapsed, right? The US doesn't seem to be very interested in how it is perceived around the world, and so, relatively speaking, China kind of becomes suddenly, above. In many countries, that applies even to Canada, Mexico, most European countries, and so on. The second thing is that the things why many people had negative view of China, human rights, assertive foreign policy, now when we look at the US, at Trump, a lot of those things we see coming from the US. So again, relatively speaking, to many people, China doesn't seem that bad, right? Talking about, China's threat to Taiwan. Well, the US has threat to Greenland and Canada, human rights. Well, the US has issues like that. So, we do see in public opinion surveys, China is growing also absolutely, not only relatively. Now, maybe some people think, does it matter? Because also this panel talks about the geopolitics, the return of geopolitics. Well, I study, kind of perceptions. I think it matters, but I would kind of make a difference how it matters. Soft power perceptions matter, I would say, in a bit of a longer term. So in a way, you try to build your positions. If countries have good image of each other, they are maybe more willing to enter in a trade pact, invest, and so on. Right now, when you ask about the return of geopolitics, I would say that many countries, especially we see it from the US, of course, Russia, they are kind of cashing in on the previous positions. So basically, they do a bet that we don't care about what happens to our image, we want returns now. And so my answer would be that the image of China may be important again when China kind of tries to cash in, because I don't think China is cashing in such a way as the US is doing right now.
We talked about China and the US a bit. I think we should also talk about the EU. And I'm turning to Dr. Matura. In the EU context, when and how did geopolitical logic reassert itself over technical or trade consideration, if it happened at all?
Hi there, thanks for having me today. If I may reflect a bit upon what has been said so far, I know that we really love to label Xi Jinping as the main culprit, but I'm not sure that Xi Jinping is he rather the consequence or the cause, because I think the main reason for this rise of tensions between countries, especially the United States and China, is the accumulation of enormous economic tensions in the past 30, 40 years. And you might easily get to the conclusion that Xi Jinping was elected Chinese General Secretary for the very reason that China doesn't want to change its economic system, and he was the right person, the right man in the right place to maintain the current system in the country. Now, if you think about it, who are the very interested ones in the current economic system in the country are the Chinese major members of the elite, right? Most of them part of the Communist Party of China, most of them are billionaires or even richer people, and they don't want to change the system. Now, the problem is that the United States cannot change the system in China, of course, because the United States doesn't have the power to do so. So what Donald Trump started back in the 2016 and 17 years, it wasn't a major surprise, but they made a huge mistake. They really believe that they can push trade relations to change on a bilateral level. Now Donald Trump understands that they can't change trade relations on the bilateral level because trade kind of clears globally. So there's a reason now they are moving towards pushing all other countries to be harsher on China. But it's not working either, because at the very same time the Trump administration makes other huge mistakes. And some of these mistakes have a huge impact on Europe. Europe pretty much finds itself between a stone and a hard place right now. We don't have a cart, if you know the expression. And that is a major problem right now because Europe is pretty much dependent on the US, especially as long as the war in Ukraine goes on. But at the same time, we really need a lot of Chinese components and raw materials, just to mention, for example, critical minerals and so on and so forth. So when Europe started to think about it, I think it's an ongoing process and it's been going on for many years. One might quote that the so-called honeymoon period between China and the European Union ended somewhere back in 2003. And this is a slope that is getting steeper and steeper. It's a very slippery slope right now. I think the first Trump administration could be mentioned as a milestone in Europe's awakening. And then, of course, 2019, we shouldn't forget about the most recent European strategy on China, when the European Union labeled China not only an economic competitor, but also at the same time as a systemic rival. I think it was a major milestone. And then COVID-19, when European countries started to think about their economic and health security. And finally, of course, as many other speakers today have mentioned, the Russian aggression in Ukraine and China's support to that. We shouldn't forget, and maybe that's the last milestone I should mention, that just a little bit over 2 months ago, the Chinese foreign minister said that China was not interested in Russia's defeat in Ukraine. And that was explicitly told to the European Union in the EU-China summit. So I think that's the last major milestone. And maybe last sentence is that we shouldn't forget about other domains of geopolitics. So I think the whole thing started with techno-geopolitics, so technological geopolitics. First Trump administration, when I stopped buying Huawei phones because Android was not available anymore for Huawei and ZTE. And then health geopolitics during COVID-19, and now and geoeconomics throughout these years, and now finally real geopolitics with the war in Ukraine.
Thanks for the quick answers. Of course.
I'm very glad the two speakers brought up the cause why we are talking about this today's topics right now. I think one of the major reasons, I think, is the global overcapacity. And everybody knows it's caused by China. Okay? And it's only for its own economic profits. And remember, and it's also about its aggressive geopolitical ambitions.
Thanks for the quick answers. I think we will have time to do all the questions that we planned. So sanctions, tariffs, export controls are no longer only technical economic tools, but they are also signs of political alignment or strategic rivalry. I think we should talk about who shapes these new rules and how do countries or regions experience their impact. And I'm again turning to Mr. Orbán. When we look at these newly emerging rules and norms which are shaping the flow of goods and capital, what global patterns do you see? I mean, who sets the rules and how?
So I think, first of all, it's pretty chaotic. So right now, a lot of players are trying to set rules. But it is also clear that the most important rule setter, not the only one, this is a very important distinction, but the most important rule setter is the United States, which is initiating a major restructuring of the global economic order. The whole vision, and I think it is slightly underappreciated, the magnitude of this, the whole vision of relying or mostly relying US budget incomes on tariffs, and it's not an accidental peril that there was the big beautiful tax bill, so the big tax cuts, and they came at the same time as the big tariffs. It is a very clear vision where there is less reliance on the domestic income and more reliance on taxing the world, essentially. Now, it comes with the forced investments. It's very important. Japan is being forced to commit to $500 billion of investments in the United States. South Korea is being forced to commit to very significant FDI. So the tariffs are coming with these forced agreements about about investing into the United States. And I know there are all these kind of question marks around how it is enforceable, right? We don't know exactly, but those commitments have been made. If once you committed 500 billion, you cannot get away with 5 billion. It is a very different logic. I think that most analysts are hooked up on the fact that, hey, tariffs are not efficient, but I think it's a massive misunderstanding. This is a complete reordering of how the US envisions the world economy to work. Will they pull it off? We do not know. I think that there are stronger arguments in favor of being able to pull it off than most people appreciate. It is very likely to come with a certain reordering of the monetary order as well globally. So we are seeing tectonic shifts, or essentially attempts to implement tectonic shifts of how the world is arranged in terms of economics. This will very clearly create countries who are fundamentally dissatisfied with this effort, and some of these will end up being focused around China, and I think the PRC will make very good use of these countries, will give them reasonably good offers, massive overcapacity. There was a Beijing University professor just a few months ago who had, which I think is an ingenious idea, which said that, let's do a Chinese Marshall Plan. Let's just export our overcapacity in the form of a sort of quote-unquote Marshall Plan, and give everybody cheap energy-generating entities, obviously connected to Beijing through the inverters. So it will create reactions, and these reactions, for some countries, the PRC's offer will be a lot more attractive than the United States offer. What I'm saying, it's extremely hard to see how this will play out, and the effort is not like a madman running around in a china shop. There is a lot more vision behind this than the rhetoric of Donald Trump suggests.
Dr. Chu, what do you think? To what extent does China shape the rules of this game? Is Beijing being more proactive or reactive in this regard?
I believe that China is no longer just reacting to the trend that we have covered so far. It has also become a role shaper in many ways. So what I can see is that China has actually adopted what I describe as a dual strategy. This defensive in some domains while offensive or proactive in others. When it comes to proactive actions that China has taken, let me give you some examples. When it comes to alternative institutional building, we have seen Chinese efforts to try to really consolidate some of the initiatives surrounding the Belt and Road Initiative in its attempt to try to really set its own norms for finance and connectivity. And when it comes to tech standards, we have seen continuous Chinese efforts to try to set rules of game at the international level when it comes to 5G, digital yuan, and also the data governance models. So we can't really ignore the Chinese efforts to really change the rule of game in this particular domain. And once again, when it comes to semiconductors, the Chinese effort to try to continuously push for the state-led investment in the different subsectors of the domestic supply chain has continuous without any kind of hesitation. But we need to be careful about the extent to which this endeavors can be potentially successful, especially when it comes to the most state-of-the-art technologies in the semiconductor domain, when it comes to, for example, the most advanced semiconductor equipment and also the EDA tools, the software tools that the IC design firms use to design their semiconductors. They are still very much dominated in the hands of the Western giants. So in a nutshell, we have really seen the Chinese dual strategies of offensive and defensive tactics. When it comes to reactive actions by China, we have seen that many of the Chinese actions, such as export controls, counter sanctions, have been primarily in response to the US orchestrated export controls or investment screening endeavors. So in a nutshell, I think China has really moved from a reluctant rule taker to a more ambitious rule maker. And the end outcome, I think, is still very uncertain, unfortunately.
Dr. Turcsányi, in your experience, how much trust do people place in China versus in the US when it comes to setting fair rules, if fairness matters at all?
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical on this one. Also, from the surveys, you don't see that people would expect that the world is fair, so to say. So, if you look at the countries which have today kind of better view of the US, that would be Poland, for instance, that would be Japan, that would be Philippines. The reason why these countries have a better view of the US than China is not because they see US inherently more moral or more fair, but it's better for them. And also, at least that's what I think, based on the indications. And also, I think the countries which, also previously had a better view of China, such as Pakistan, for instance, that was a country which was standing out, maybe what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, and that again what Krisztián probably was saying a bit earlier, maybe here in Europe we were one of the a bit naive part of the world. We really believed that geopolitics is that. It wasn't, but we probably, many people here believe that. And then during previous American administrations there was discussion about rule-based international order, and Europe. I think many in Europe genuinely believed that we are in a business of creating a fair international order. The problem is, I think much of the world never believed in these sort of things, and even these narratives were perceived as a defense from the leaders of the world to defend the status quo. And the big problem is that now with Trump, in fact, he seems to validate what most of the world thought. He basically says, yes, it's about naked power, it's about interest, it's about who's in position to benefit, and so on. And I think that's also why much of Europe is very shocked, because we kind of woke up. And I think that's also why a lot of the rest of the world is not as shocked, because in a way the rest of the world, I think many, the perception is that's what we thought. Good, now you guys are clear about that. So yeah, I think the question of fairness, I think for the time being is not up there.
Dr. Matura, what do you think? How do countries in our region, in Central and Eastern Europe, perceive and experience these impacts coming both from Washington and Beijing? Do they see them as some kind of leverage or more as restriction?
Let me circle back to what Krisztián started with, that I totally agree with the part that the United States really want to upend the very system it created in the past 40, 50 years with the rise of global neoliberalism. However, I have doubts about the other part, that countries would find China's offer better. I don't really think that China has a real offer, and because what the ambassador said, that there is enormous overcapacity. Practically in the world there are two types of countries, or three, but let me focus on two: net exporters and net importers. So consumers and producers. There are some healthy economies that are more or less in balance, but generally speaking, major Anglo-Saxon countries, and first and foremost the United States, have been so far the major overconsumers. And many of the Asian countries, some of the European countries, Germany for example, and first and foremost of course China, have been the major overproducers with enormous overcapacity. Now let me give you some numbers. Right now China produces roughly 1/3 of the global industrial output. So 33% of global industrial output comes from China. That's insane. Meanwhile, China is responsible for roughly 14% of global consumption. So there is a tremendous gap between the two, and in the past 15 years the Chinese government should have solved this huge imbalance. They should have chosen from three different solutions. The first one is an overcapacity recession, that they just simply realize that they have no one to sell their stuff, they shut down factories, a lost decade, recession, and of course the popularity, to say the least, of the Communist Party of China would have been shaken. Option number two, which would have been the optimal course, was increasing consumption in the country, which was introduced and announced in the 12th five-year plan 15 years ago. They never managed to pull that off. And number three, doubling down on exports. The good old, recipe, let's export and export and export. And now we see that the world, and I say the world because it's not only the United States, but the rest of the world is fed up with that. I know that in the news it seems like that, okay, if the United States or Europe stops buying Chinese stuff, China can easily turn to the global south. It can't. Simply because the global south is still relatively poor, and also because they don't want to get their own industrial base get ruined by the Chinese overcapacity. Think about it, that China has an overcapacity, for example, in the steel industry that is more than the total annual consumption of the whole European Union. This is not something that India is ready to absorb, because that would put, Tata Steel and Mittal Steel on the brinks of collapse. So they don't want to do that. So as long as the Chinese are not ready to change their own economic structure, and they are not ready to do so for political reasons, among other reasons, I don't think that, for example, Vietnam could really make a deal with China, because they both want to export. They are just simply not compatible with each other. They are not complementary with each other, economically speaking. So to get back to Central and Eastern European countries, I think we see the very same pattern. In the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen the rise and the fall and eventually the collapse of the 16+1 cooperation, practically for the very same reasons, that we had very different economic expectations compared to what the Chinese side was offering to Central and Eastern Europe. So most of the Central European countries, especially under the pressure of the geopolitical circumstances in Ukraine, swiftly turned back to their original and classical partners, the United States and Europe, NATO, and so on and so forth, with obvious exception of Hungary, at least for the next couple of months.
Let's talk a bit about Taiwan's special position. It's at the center of the global technology economy. Mr. Wang, how have these new export controls and new rules influenced Taiwan's role in the global supply chain?
Well, of course, we are definitely impacted by this crisis, because Taiwan is the number 21st economy in the world, producing 90% of the advanced semiconductors for the world. And most importantly, the 50%, half of the global trade is going through Taiwan Strait. So in the short term, we do see some confidence shakings among our business, asking for help from government. However, as you can recall, over the past two financial crises, in the world, in the previous experience, Taiwanese business seemed to do much better than the other countries to survive. Why? Because I'm very proud to say that we are not quite worried about this business going through this crisis, because our Taiwanese business is always famous for its swiftness and efficientness doing business. So that's why they can survive from the previous financial crisis. And I think they can still do the same thing this time. But this time, I think there is something different. It's very different from the previous experience. So probably we need to do something different and more to work together to overcome this crisis. I think the good idea is that we already have been doing this with the EU members in the US, Japan, the so-called like-minded countries, that to establish a so-called non-red global supply chain. And I think it's imminent for us to do this. And I think this time we need to do more and quickly.
This rivalry between the US and China is increasingly forcing others to choose sides, whether explicitly or implicitly. And for Europe, and especially, of course, for our region, it is not only a political choice, but it has deep market and economic consequences. So let's talk a bit about Europe's economic choices. Mr. Orbán, how is this choice being framed in the political debate? Is it dominated by security logic or by economic interest or the combination of them or something completely different?
Well, certainly a combination of that. I think that we are very much in a pickle. Europe is in a terrible situation in this case. We understand that the United States is upending the order. I mean, China and the United States are upending the order that the European economy have been built for. So just keep in mind, we have been the central export economy for the world, and then increasingly China caught up with us. But especially Germany, but Central Eastern Europe has been major beneficiaries of this order, what was called globalization. Now that globalization is over. It's very clear. It's over. In that form, it's over. And then there is Europe, and I just will be a little bit longer than earlier. I would like to tell you one example which I think is very indicative of the things to come. This is the Chinese-Ethiopian relationship. Ethiopia is the most promising market in Africa. It's 110 million people, has been growing average 9% GDP growth in the past 15 years. Okay, so that's the best case, the best story you have in Africa. China has cut a major deal with Addis Ababa, and they have connected Addis Ababa with Djibouti on the coast, and they built a highway, they built a rail connection from Chinese money with Chinese developers, and the agreement is that in all of the industrial parks along that highway, along that railway connection, these are Chinese companies who are operating there. Chinese companies staffed, obviously, with Ethiopian workers. So what could Europe do from that deal? Okay? Can we cut a deal where Europe is offering a comprehensive package of rail and highway development, where we are providing the financing, we are securing the suppliers, and we are ensuring a deal where only European companies can be in the industrial parks? Plus, are we ready to grease the wheels where the wheels have to be greased? Right? And the answer is obviously no. So in this competition, in this kind of, which is a lot more like concessions, this is like a concession for China, right? This is, they are receiving a concession from Ethiopia. So how can Europe compete in that environment? Europe is not a state. Europe cannot bind, circumvent its own rules at its will, just as Donald Trump decided to hit the pause button on the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That was one of the first moves that Donald Trump did in his second administration. So we cannot do that. So we are not really well prepared for that kind of economy, world economy that is coming. So what to do? And at the same time, we are extremely dependent, especially on aerial defense, on the United States. Any European cities can be hit with a cruise missile from Russia. Any, okay, including Lisbon. So, and we are not equipped to defend them. So what can we do? And I think that Europe gave the right reaction. I think that shifting our economic model, I mean, it's not Europe who gave the reaction, it's really Germany, it's the new German government, which said, okay, we used to be an export economy, now it was a consumption good economy, and we will be a capex good economy. It's a massive shift. It is $500 billion to $1 trillion allocated to this effort, and it will be a lot of capex investments. And yes, consumption good companies will go down, will be relatively a lot less important than they were in the past 30 years. It will be a lot about infrastructure goods. But that's an entire economic model change. And that will happen in the next 10 years. I think next 10 years, I think there will be massive rearmament. All good, all good. What we have to do is somehow survive the next 10 years. And in this next 10 years, we see the rearguard action from the 5 major German companies who are super exposed to the PRC. And, you know, from a security perspective, it sometimes looks incomprehensible what they are doing. But if you are looking at their own interests, they have no chance. They're stuck there. So if you're just looking at the individual interest of those very large German companies, it's understandable what they do. Is it good? Well, in the short term, it's good. You don't want the collapse of these companies. But in the long term, it's obviously not too beneficial. So we are in a pickle. I don't think anybody has a good idea what to do in this situation. I think Europe is playing for time, and this is the best that we can do.
From Beijing's perspective, how important is Europe economically in this rivalry? I mean, Dr. Chu, does China see Europe as a market to retain or as a strategic partner that can offset US balance?
I think it's both. So when it comes to economics, EU remains China's second largest trading partner, and Europe matters for export, supply chains, and technological collaborations to some extent. When it comes to green technology, Europe's demand for clean technology is also critical for China's industrial future. And when it comes to the semiconductor domain, the European car makers, AI and machinery industries still rely very heavily on the semiconductors produced in East Asia. So this means that the European economic prosperity has continuously to be closely linked to not only China but also to Taiwan, because there's no denial that the Chinese market share of the mature semiconductor chips at the global level has increased over time. And also, as Ambassador Wang pointed out earlier, the Chinese has really dominated the most advanced semiconductor fabrication. So this implies that should one day China attacks Taiwan, the European economic prosperity will suffer a great deal. It will really suffer a collateral damage, like the rest of the world, that are important components of the global digital economy. And when it comes to strategic importance, certainly Beijing is of the hope that Europe will resist for alignment with Washington on areas such as technology and security. And Beijing has also tactically engaged bilaterally with members of the European Union in order to avoid the formulation of a unified European Union stance when it comes to China. And lastly, Beijing has tried to frame Europe as an independent pole in a bipolar world. But what is the reality check? My view is, I think China still has a very difficult role to play in order to try to achieve the aforementioned 2 objectives. The bottom line is, from Beijing's perspective, Europe is both a market it cannot lose, but at the same time, it is a counterweight it cannot really fully count on. Again, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, it is a fact that the EU as a whole has more or less really closely related to the US position as compared to the Chinese one. So I think the Chinese has its own interest calculations when it comes to its perception of European Union, but whether or not it is going to be successful in achieve both of these aforementioned objectives is a big question mark. Yeah.
Mr. Wang, in the context of the US-China rivalry, what do you think Europe should understand better from Taiwan's economic experience?
Well, I wouldn't say one model is good for everyone. Okay. I think Taiwan and Europe can definitely learn from each other. And actually, I would like to share with you some facts about how close the trade relations between Taiwan and the whole Europe. Actually, there are more than 20 trade or representative offices established by European countries in Taiwan. And the investment from Europe countries, okay, the total of the investment from a European country is more than the combination of the United States and Japan, the investment in Taiwan. Okay. So we see this is a great partnership, and there's still a great potential to increase, because as Taiwanese perspective, we see the Europe used to quite dependent on the United States in terms of military, and the consumption of products, okay, on China. Okay. But after this historical event happening right now, I think it's time for you to think, to refocus, maybe to industrialize your industry and the trade by working with Taiwan. I think we can offer something in a couple of areas. I would call it SCATES, okay, in 5 areas. Stands for semiconductor, and the next generation communication, AI, military defense, and last but least is the surveillance.
At the European level, Dr. Matura, what do you think, what strategies could credibly give Europe room for maneuver either towards the US or towards the China?
You know, in the early years of the Cold War, the Western European strategy was summarized in one single sentence: keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Now, history repeats itself to a certain extent. Indeed, I think in the first or the next 10 years, in the short term, we need to keep the Americans in, no matter what. We need to keep the Russians out, no matter what. And we need the Germans up, right? And I think it's very important that not only the Germans, we need every European nation to stand up and to boost their defense and industrial capacity. And industrial capacity, I think it's a key here, because we tend to forget that even though technology is super important, to build the heavy steel that is based on technology, including tanks, drones, whatsoever, it's equally important. That is one of the major problems of the United States right now, that it has lost the industrial capacity. I don't know whether you heard about it, but right now, one of the major perils the United States is about to face, that China's shipbuilding capacity is 240 times of the American, which is crazy. And I don't even dare to think about the European. Maybe it's not that bad, actually, because we have quite a few of seafaring nations. So the time frame, I think, really matters. In the short run, we have to focus on boosting our industrial and military industrial complex capacities and our technology. And in the long run, frankly speaking, I don't care about competing with China, because China has its own problems. If we are lucky, China will collapse under its own weight and will follow the fate of Japan, if we are very lucky. I think what really matters is that Europe should find its way back to its roots, that is based on freedom and education. Special education. I'm son of a teacher. I'm a teacher myself, so I always talk about education. We have to do something about, for example, the overall financial background of European education. Just think about it, 20, 30, 40 years ago, in Western Europe, if someone was even an assistant professor, associate professor, they were part of the upper middle class. I don't know what was the last time you checked wages in the UK. You couldn't make a living if you are an associate professor, especially if you have to rent a flat. You are lower middle class right now. And to keep the Chinese in mind, that's a specialty of the Chinese culture, that the small chat is very different over there, that you can include a lot of things that you shall not include in a small chat or small talk in Europe, including wages. And after a while, I started to use it to flip it around, and now I ask the Chinese friends, that, okay, how much do you earn? And 10 years ago, a Chinese lecturer at the university was already earning 4 times more than the Hungarian peer of his, even though Hungary's GDP per capita 10 years ago was like 3 to 4 times higher than the Chinese. So this is where we have to return to, because actually China's overcapacity wouldn't be a problem if Europe and the West in general didn't lose its industrial and technological superiority to the Chinese. If we were, exporting, I don't know, starships to the Chinese, I wouldn't mind buying electric vehicles from China. But the problem is that we have lost this difference, this technological superiority, and I think that's the first and foremost important thing to focus on.
And my closing question to Dr. Turcsányi is that for a smaller and mid-sized state, how do you think that this US-China rivalry shape economic opportunities or vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think this panel might have sounded a bit like, we are in a bipolar world. Many people talk about that. I personally don't think that's, maybe the most accurate way of perceiving reality. India would certainly not agree. A lot of other countries don't think that they are choosing between the US and China. So that's maybe one thing, I want to mention. I mean, even the EU and US, of course, are not as close, as you would expect a bipolar world to be. But in principle, this sort of even bipolar or multipolar world means, in principle, that the smaller countries have more offer to choose from, and in a way that has been one of the key point of success why China has been, received so well in Africa or around the world. Not because those countries preferred China, but they were happy that after decades they're not forced to choose one model, one offer, coming from the DC, but now they can choose two. And if you can choose from two, you can choose the better one, ideally. Of course, not always, but ideally. And many countries around the world have, played this game, and some of them played it pretty well. Maybe Southeast Asia, and so on. There is a discussion about hedging, and so on. So now, in principle, yes, that's the situation. You can, pick a better offer. And maybe to conclude, looking in Central and Eastern Europe, and I think Tamás mentioned something like that. We are in a bit different situation than Southeast Asia. In fact, most of the world. A few years ago, I kind of looked at CEE region and I looked how much we trade with China and so on. And I was surprised to find that we are actually a region least dependent on China from all over the world in terms of investment, in terms of our exports to China and so on. Why that is the case? Of course, because we are very dependent on the Western Europe, right? In fact, that was one of the key things why 16+1, was born after the global financial crisis 2012. The idea to diversify economically. And in a way, the idea is not bad. The thing is that it doesn't seem very realistic, right? Hungary has been trying that, but it actually shows. And in these very weeks, it's facing pressure from the US to cut the Russian gas and so on. So, while for many countries around the world, this hedging may be a realistic option, I think for the CEE, somehow, at least in the moment, it seems we are destined to be in the EU and, just hope that the EU as a whole, can succeed and then, we succeed within the EU.
Thank you all for your insights. Unfortunately, our time is up and we do not want to derail the whole conference, so we will not be taking any questions from the audience. But again, thank you for coming and for sharing your quite deep experience with us. Thank you.